If you've been paying attention to the NFL draft, then you already have your scouting report for quarterbacks. But what about those positions that have a huge impact on the game? Well, joining us to break it down is a very special guest, former NFL linebacker and current NFL commentator, Chad Brown. Chad, how are you, sir?
I am fantastic, my man. How you doing?
I'm excited to talk about this NFL action. So now, I want you to break down some sleepers at a position. But first, what is your definition of a sleeper?
Well, when I got this assignment to be on with you, I saw the word sleeper and I thought, well, what does that mean? It means something different to everybody. You know, you could still be a first round pick, but be a sleeper because maybe you slid due to some perceptions about your talents, maybe some off the field things. But typically, I think sleeper guys are someone who's maybe going to be drafted rounds 2, 3, or 4 who present a greater value on the field maybe for their football team as opposed to where their draft status was. So you think of a third round pick, maybe you can find a starter at center, maybe a safety can come up as a starter in the third round. But if you were a third round offensive tackle and you were to start your rookie year, I guess that would qualify you as a sleeper pick because typically offensive tackles are, first 10, 15 picks. Those guys are expected to be starters, not third round offensive tackles.
All right, we're going to start with defensive tackle. Chad, there's been a lot of talk about Jalen Carter. What do you think about the defensive tackle from Georgia?
Well, Jalen Carter, I think, is the best defensive player in the draft. The size, he plays with amazing leverage, the motor that he has. Obviously, the off-the-field stuff has been talked about quite a bit with the car accident, with his really poor workout. So I've got him going to Seattle with the 5th pick in the draft. Pete Carroll has made a career out of handling some difficult personalities. Not saying Jalen's a difficult personality, but he's certainly the off-the-field stuff brings into mind some character questions. So for guys like Richard Sherman and Marshawn Lynch and the number of cast of characters that Pete Carroll has managed really well in Seattle, I can see him being a perfect fit there. And in some ways, he would qualify maybe as a sleeper pick in some ways, going the number 5th pick in the draft, because I think he's the best defensive player in the draft and maybe the overall best player in the draft.
Indeed. So who do you think is going to be an actual sleeper at defensive tackle, Chad?
I'll go with Siaki Ika from Baylor. Definitely an interior defensive lineman. Got some versatility. He can play the nose. He can play in the 1. He can play a 3 as well. His production dropped a little bit from 2021 to 2022, where he was one of the more active defensive linemen in the Big 12. I called a couple of his games this last year. I like his projected a high end kind of thing where he can, I think, come in with the right situation with the right defensive line coach who will demand that he stays in shape, doesn't pick up too much weight because he actually gained some weight from his final game at Baylor before his pro day. So he's going to be need to be a guy who watches his weight, but from a production standpoint, from a skill set standpoint, I love what he brings. And so because of some of those question marks, I can see him being a third round pick to the right team, but a guy who can actually dominate on the interior of the defensive line.
Indeed. Chad, some people say this is one of the most difficult positions in all of the sport. Cornerback, who you got a sleeper there?
I got Kaylee Ringo out of Georgia, a guy who's probably going to play in the NFL about 210 pounds, but still runs a 4.3. So a freaky athlete, a great competitor. Obviously playing at Georgia, you're going to play at the highest levels of college football. There's some, fluid concerns about his game, but I think in the right situation, because they played a lot of man and a lot of zone at Georgia, the right situation for him could be a number of different teams. Again, I wouldn't put him every down on the opposing team's best wide receiver because he does have a little bit of stiffness in those hips at that larger size. But in the right situation, he's a guy who can tackle. Like I said, he can play man, he can play zone, and he plays at that 210 size. He doesn't play small. He's able to come up and hit you as a defender in the run game.
All right, going to the offensive side of the ball, wide receivers. Who do you got at wide receiver?
I called a number of this guy's games over the last couple seasons, and almost every game I called for him, for his team, he had a big splash play in that game. Marvin Mims from Oklahoma, another 4.3 guy. On the slider side, as far as a build, maybe 5'10", 180. So a smaller, thinner guy, definitely doesn't play big, but plays fast and explosive. And there's one thing you cannot coach at the wide receiver position, it is speed. He gets behind defenses. And if, at some point, if you don't have a safety over the top of him, he's going to exploit that and be a big play waiting to happen. I like for him to pick up some size and some thickness as his NFL career goes along in order for him to be able to get off of press man coverage and things like that. But from a pure explosive standpoint, for him to go maybe late second round, in the third round of the draft, whoever brings him in is going to get a guy who the opposing defensive coordinator is always going to have to worry about. We can't put this guy in too many one-on-one situations because he can go over the top on us.
Who would you compare him to that's already in the NFL right now, Chad?
Well, the Eagles have a couple of smaller, slimmer guys as well. Heck, they got a Heisman Trophy pick out of Alabama who plays smaller, but has certainly been effective in the right scheme. So I see him kind of being a parallel to that. A lot of crossing routes, a lot of deep routes, not a very intricate route runner, but when you have that kind of speed, you don't necessarily need to be.
All right, that's a good comparison. Now, it's a lot of hype about the actual quarterback position, but protecting the quarterback is probably the number one thing you need outside of the quarterback. Who do you like at offensive tackle?
I'm going to go with Braden Daniels. He's a guy not being talked about maybe in the first two rounds, but at 6'3", 295, very athletic offensive tackle, played at Utah. And Utah, they've got a bit of a power scheme that they go with. So you're going to be very effective in the run game as far as being a smaller offensive lineman, a good grade as far as run blocking. But I think the smaller size makes him athletic to deal with some of those super athletic edge guys in the league. A true 5-year guy at Utah, so a lot of playing experience. He's not a guy who you're trying to figure out what's he going to be in the NFL. I think we know what he is. And in the right scheme, I think he can be really, really effective. Again, Kyle Whittingham prides himself in that Utah program on being very tough. As a guy who rushed against offensive linemen for most of my NFL career, usually the guys who had a very tough mindset, which watching Brady Daniels, he has that same mindset, and that's kind of the culture in Utah, were some of the more difficult guys for me to deal with because they never took plays off.
Indeed. Final question for you. I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball. Chad, what do you think about this overall draft class outside of quarterback, just as a whole? Would you consider this strong, weak? What are your thoughts? Gotcha.
It's always a bit of a year-to-year proposition with the strength of draft classes. I don't think it's a very strong wide receiver class. I think the quarterback class, there is definitely some high-level college production, but there's pretty major doubts or question marks for all those guys. So I think the draft is usually kind of viewed through the quarterback lens. So from that lens, it may be a bit of an off year, but there are other positions where there's some pretty good depth as well. So I think if you are a team with a number of draft picks, you're looking at this draft with an eye that I can get some tremendous value out of that. While there may not be a bunch of surefire Hall of Famers, but there's tremendous value that can come with it.
I told a fib, Chad. I said that was the last question. I actually got one more based on your answer. You got one pick out of everybody, regardless of position. Who do you believe is the best value, regardless of position?
Regardless of position, obviously it's a quarterback league. So by giving me the opportunity to go away from quarterback, I'm going to go with Jalen Carter. I know those off-the-field question marks are pretty significant for a lot of teams, but what I saw on tape was clearly the best player in college football. And again, given the right defensive line coach and the right situation, maybe a defensive line group where he walks into where there's already an established veteran who can, kind of put the rookie put his arm around the rookie and show him the right way to do things, particularly from a weight and a conditioning perspective. I think the sky's the limit for this guy. He can come in as a day one starter and make your defensive line group better as a rookie. And sometimes that's difficult for those young guys to do, but he's got that kind of talent and that kind of technique coming from one of the best defenses in college football.
That's interesting, Chad. So who would you say would be his NFL sort of counterpart? Who would be somebody that you would liken him to that's currently in the league?
That's a good question. I suppose I would go back to maybe a Warren Sapp kind of thing, but I think he's got a more of a varied skill set than Warren Sapp had coming into the NFL. Warren Sapp was certainly an interior defensive lineman, but he was much more of a penetrator. Jalen Carter can be a two-gap guy. He can play with leverage and hold up offensive linemen and keep his linebackers free. So he's got a little bit more versatility to his game. But if he were to go into that kind of Tampa 2 system where he was asked just to be a penetrator, I think he could excel in that as well. So I think there's a reason why he's on so many teams' boards because of his varied skill set. Whether you want him to be a two-gap kind of guy or a pure penetrator, he can get it done either way.
Hey, sports fans, if you want to see more conversations with athletes and stars, check out these videos right here and be sure to subscribe for more from USA Today Sports.